Okay, come on in, make yourselves at home. Just don't make yourselves at that much at home, okay? Stay out of the refrigerator. Oh, I don't care. You can go get in the refrigerator you want. Doesn't matter to me. There might be some old stale food in there left over from last year's fellowship or something like that. Come on in. Good to see you. Anybody notice it was raining outside a little bit? Wow. Hailing. I heard some thunder a while ago. Yeah. What a deal. Glad you're here. Glad you made it in. Glad it's not Egypt and didn't have the hail knocking people down, killing them and everything. It's big hail. Whoa, well that's not good. I don't like that. I don't like that. That's the kind the roofers like, but nobody else does. Don't like that kind that messes up big hail. Hey, glad you're here this evening. We're going to do something. I'm not sure what we're going to do, but we're going to do something here in just a little bit. Oh, how about we have class? That sounds like a winner. Let's go ahead with what we normally do on Wednesday evenings. As you know, we've been dealing with questions that you have turned in. The box is still out there in the foyer. If you have a further question you'd like to do, we've come through some. We're going to go through some this evening. We've got a few more lined up. It's not that I'm out of questions by any means. And maybe I'll start throwing my questions at you. How about that? No telling what we'd come up with then. Let's see, I was trying to think of any announcements we need to make in particular. I think the ladies' deal is scheduled for Friday. The coffee, I think, is supposed to be Friday morning at 10 a.m. There is, on Saturday at 2 p.m., there's a memorial service for Maddie Rubel and all. Seemed like I ought to know something else. I don't know much else. I was trying to think of anything else immediately comes to mind. There were other things in the bulletin this last week, so there might still be a copy of it laying around here that somebody didn't turn into a paper airplane, so you're welcome to check it out if that's there. Again, we need to figure out and get that online with us. But anyway, don't know anything special else this evening, unless you've got something you need to throw out there. We'll leave it at that, and we'll get into our study here in just a moment with all those wonderful people online. If you're online with us, we're glad that you're online. Make sure you keep that long pole that keeps you balanced. Okay, never mind. We'll leave it at that. Let's, now that everybody's getting into their seats, let's take a moment. Let's have a prayer together, and then we will get right into our study this evening. Father and God, again, for the opportunity to be here, to spend this time together, we thank you. You've given us so much, and a wonderful place to meet, wonderful people to share it with, and we're thankful for the beauty of the Word that is put before us. And as we deal with questions that we put out there, help us to arrive at good answers that are beneficial, Father. Help us to be accepting of those things that you keep to yourself, and help us to be knowing those things that you would have us to know. We know you supply us with what we need to know and what will benefit our lives in the very best way, and we pray that we may always trust you to give us those things. Thank you, Father, for the time together. Be with the families who are dealing with loss at this time. We're thankful for the lives that we can honor and bless, but we pray that you'll be with those who are recovering as well. Help them to be restored in the very, very best possible way. And now, Father, as we study, may we be open, may we be considerate, and may we always do what you would desire best and learn the most. And it is in Jesus we pray. Amen. All right. This evening we have we got basically three questions. If you looked at the notes I sent out today, if you didn't, you can look on the sheet. There are the three questions, or a summarization perhaps of some of the questions are on the notes, and we're going to talk about those here this evening for a little while. If we get through with that, then we'll take a nap and wait for the children to get out. How about that? I just called this, I threw out there, what do you know? Because it's kind of like there are things that we know and things that we don't know. You know, and I put on there this verse from the end of the Gospel of John, where he says in verse 25 of John 21, right at the very end, he says, and there are also many other things that Jesus did which are not, which if they were written one by one, I suppose even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. And an amen is at the end of that. But it's the idea that we don't know everything that was said or done. We don't know everything. We don't know the full mind of God. And sometimes we question, well, why did God do this? What was that about? Why is that? Sometimes we have to accept there are things that we just don't have the access to know. We can summarize, we can make assumptions, we can generalize, we can question, we can look at it, and we can think, well, it might be this, but there are things that throughout our lives we're just not going to know. I know that's a fact because I don't know every answer. And if I don't know every answer, then nobody does. Oh, well, maybe that's not exactly true, but anyway, I think it is true that there will be many things that we will not know in this world, and all I always think there will come a time we will know the things. I think we know what we need to know, and there will come a time we know even more than we know now. But one thing I did, and I just have one other thought, is, something I've come to recognize is the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. I think it's the people who don't know very much that come up and think they know a lot. So maybe I'm really smart because I don't know anything, I think. Okay, right, I'll leave it at that. I'm getting kind of silly now. But let's go into this. These are questions that you guys have put forward again, is what we're looking at. The first question we're going to look at this evening, it says, when the graves were opened, Matthew 27, 52 through 53, were the dead that arose physical bodies or spirits? I don't know. Shall we move on to the next question? All right, let's look at that. Let's spend a moment with that and think about that. I put a few thoughts down here. One thing that we might note in this, in the passage that is mentioned, and I added it in here. Let's just jump down there and read that. It's point number 2 on your notes or on the screen. It says in verse 52, and the graves were open. This is talking about, of course, this is at the death of Jesus. You remember there's several things happen at the death of Jesus. There is the darkness that's over the land, then there's this earthquake, and then the veil of the temple is split or rent, torn open. And then it says, Matthew records in this, and the graves were opened, that's verse 52, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep, which is a phrase meaning who had died, were raised. And coming out of the graves, I hope they were dead if they were in the graves, coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Now, whether that means they came out of the graves after the resurrection or they went into the city after the resurrection depends on the grammatical construction of the thing, I think. But it appears that after the resurrection, they came out to be seen by other people. So again, the question put out there, were these literal physical people? Were they resurrected into physical bodies, or were they spirits or spiritual bodies in that regard? I don't know. Somebody's got a thought they want to throw in before I jump in on top of this. You're welcome to.
1 Thessalonians 4:16, when we read about that the dead in Christ first will rise.
Okay.
And keeping that in mind, Paul writes that nothing that is mortal can enter the heavenly realm.
Okay. Yeah, as Paul writes, and you mentioned there in 1 Thessalonians 4 in the chapter, and talking about that resurrection, they will by no means precede us or go before us, but the dead in Christ shall rise first, and then we who are alive and remain shall rise up to meet him, with them to meet him in the air. But you also point out 1 Corinthians 15, where he says basically that you die and you do not come back as the same planet as one kind coming back as another, that flesh and blood does not inherit this and so forth. So we're into some of this, but this may be a little bit of a unique situation, I think, in this regard. And so as we look at it, but I think you're on a good point. You're on a good point. Okay, Dwayne, you got something really big to throw at us? Okay.
And then it said they appeared to many.
Okay. You read my notes, right? Okay. No, no, that's very good. No, you're right. You're right on target. That they came up out of the graves and they did appear to people, and they did not appear to be apparitions of some kind or another. It does not appear that they came and they disappeared or they just appeared in front of it. It says they came in and they went into the city and so forth. So forth. Yeah, Larry? Yes, that's a good point. While they are not named here, it just mentions saints and that's an interesting term, but it obviously people then knew who they were, presented themselves. If they hadn't known who they were, it wouldn't have made any difference. You say, well, you say you rose from the dead, but who in the world are you? You know. But they were recognizable people in that regard. Okay. Of course, we know that Spirit can take on a physical form to appear to people and be seen in that same way. I often think about the occasion where Samuel came back to speak to Saul at the Witch of Endor, in that Old Testament account. It says, I see him coming up. It says, it looks like an old man. And that was kind of a depressing thought. Did you ever think about that, how depressing that is? That if you come out of the grave, you're going to be old. I was hoping to be a lot younger when I come back from the grave, okay? But in all seriousness, I don't know that Samuel came back as a physical human being, but he was recognizable, at least to the people that were there. I don't know, how that worked exactly. I wasn't there, but in that regard. But I think you're on a good track, Dwayne, with your comments in that regard. They came up, they were seen, they were recognizable, Larry says. Okay, yes, ma'am.
I'm thinking like Sodom and Gomorrah, the angels came there and they were men.
Okay.
They were bodies, but they
Okay. Yeah, such as the angels that presented themselves in Sodom when they came to see Lot, yes, and they had every appearance of being physical men, and yet they were not. And I think almost every time where we see or we recognize an angel, that a heavenly angel, Gabriel, or others that present themselves, that we have the appearance of a physical being in front of the person, whether it was the parents of Samson or Mary or some others who, even Gideon, when they saw the person, it was a physical person that they saw in this angel. But in this case, we're not specifically talking about an angel, but probably the question, I think the question would be more in terms of a tangible being, physical being, or more like we would probably think of as an apparition, a ghost, an intangible being. I think, now, I don't know that for sure. I'm just going off of the question that's out there, and I've been asked this along this line before. Yeah, did you have something else to add to that? Yes, ma'am. I don't know. And we put, I think I've got a note down here somewhere. It says no names are mentioned. We don't know. Well, look what I've got down here. I'll just throw those out, see if this is any help in this. As Dwayne says, note that the physical graves were opened. They came up out of physical graves. Those who were raised came out of literal graves. The physical graves were opened. They came out of literal graves. It was after the resurrection that they were seen and recognized, and as Larry says, they were recognizable people. No number of them is mentioned. How many were there? I don't know. It never gives you a number or anything like that. It doesn't give us any reference to say any numbers, and no names were mentioned. The only reference statement is that they were saints. Now, be careful when you do what? And they were men? Oh, many, yes, many, yes. Yeah, it was more than one, it was multiple. And I would, when you say, yes, when you say many bodies, I don't think of 2 or 3. I don't even think half dozen. I think there's a bunch of them. And the word saint just means set apart for a purpose or a holy purpose. And so in referencing them as saints, I don't think we're talking about the same sense in which, like the Catholic Church they go through a certain process and they have to be perceived in certain ways in order to be called a saint, like they're working on right now with that Stanley Rother thing, trying to figure out if they can make him a saint or not. There have to be certain criteria that they meet according to their church to call them a saint. Now, Peter refers to all of us as saints, that we are saints. What does that mean? We're set apart to God and to his purpose. So my assumption would be these are people whose lives have been dedicated to godly service, whether they were priests or just people that were very religious in their practice. But I would say they were not like some of the Pharisees that Jesus referenced that were more full of themselves than anything. So who they were is probably dedicated people. I have an assumption. I don't think it's people that were from way back. I don't think Moses came out of the grave. I don't think Abraham came out of the grave or something. Again, it would be somebody they would recognize, as you point out, Larry. So I think these would be more recent deaths of people that would be recognized to the people who were in Jerusalem at this time. Now, who they were, I don't know. Does that kind of touch on it? Amber, you had something.
Well, wasn't it to show them to, that after the resurrection, God fulfills promises to some extent as well?
I think, yes, yeah, that their resurrection would show God fulfills promises. There's a miraculous thing going on here, a very powerful thing going on here, and that would do that. I know there's probably some other things to this that we could add to this question in regard, did they remain alive? Did they stay with people? Did they continue an ongoing life? Or did they go back to the grave after that? Or are they probably a little bit more like Lazarus, who came from the grave and then he lived whatever life he had after that? As far as we know, we lived a normal life after that, and somewhere along the line, he died. Then these would have lived a normal life and died later. Maybe they raised some 112-year-old and he lived another 6 months. I'm being silly, I understand, but the fact is I don't know about that. But I guess you're gathering, my assumption is they were physical beings, and I think most of you probably tend to agree with that. I can't pin it down and say that is absolute, but from the wording, I would say that much like Jesus, they would appear after the resurrection in their physical bodies. Jesus was there in a physical body. He showed his scars. I don't think spirits carry around fleshly scars with them like we would think. Does that make sense? I don't know. There are a lot of things about this I don't have answers to. Do you ever wonder why after the resurrection of Jesus? Okay, firstborn of the dead, good point, and everything, that he is firstborn. But it sounds like at his death, the graves were, and then but did they, and as I said, grammatically, I don't know the language well enough to tell you that it has to be a certain way. One teacher I had, or one person commenting on it, I don't remember whether it was a teacher commented, said they were alive, but they didn't leave until after the resurrection. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. But I don't know for a fact, Question or thought about it? I mean, it's fine. Far enough? Is that enough? Or you had enough? That's as far as you want to go with that? I don't know who they were. I don't know what their status was after that. But I think, going back to what Amber said a while ago, I think it was a good testimony of the power of God to people. And so then we begin to see that. And think about this. This happens a few days later. You've got Peter and the others, Peter and the 11 on that Pentecost, and as well as some other believers there. But those men standing up and all these events happening, and you have to say, okay, there is something to this. I want to hear what they have to say. So, I think there are a lot of things going on at this point. Very good. You think? Yeah.
How many of those risen, if they didn't go back to the grave, how many of them were at Pentecost and were baptized as well?
I think if I look down here, I don't know.
No, I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
that's where my thoughts led me.
Okay. Yeah. What about those people? Were they then later? Were they at Pentecost? Maybe they were among the 120 gathered together. Maybe they were. I don't really know. And do we know we don't know what they knew either. Since we don't have any testimony from them, we don't know what they knew after they were raised in that regard. It's interesting. We talk about Lazarus being raised by Jesus. What did Lazarus know after he was raised? We don't know. We don't have any statements from him or anything like that. So I don't know. There might have been some of them right there. They might have been first in line. You never know. When this baptism started, they might have been right there in line. Were you going to say something?
Well, don't you think it's interesting? This was really, had to be something. And only one of the Gospels
Okay.
even mentions it in passing.
Yes.
And the other three Gospel writers don't even address it.
you're like, I've thought about that many times. In fact, that's why I put that note in there that it's not mentioned in any other accounts, only mentioned briefly. And I mean, it's not even a great elaboration, just this simple statement about it here in Matthew.
People came back from the dead and we saw them. Talk about it again.
I think that's kind of an almost another. I think we'd talk about that a lot more. Yeah, I think we would. Don't you think we'd be pretty skeptical? I think we would. Of course, they were skeptical of Jesus, as you remember. I would imagine some were skeptical then about these people, but, it would be, I would think more, why it's not discussed more, I don't know. Again, that's one of those things, I just don't know. If you guys got the answer, man, please fill me in on it, okay?
Well, it's not really chronological event either. I mean, it's said here, but they didn't come out of the grave until after his resurrection, so it could have been
Right.
instead of 52 and 53, it could have been 63 and 64.
Right. It could have been put much later in here, but since they didn't come back, yeah, it's not laid out exactly as many of the things in the gospel accounts are not always laid out chronologically, and it brought up. Yeah. This is the kind of thing that I would have thought maybe Luke would have put into his, but no, it's Matthew that puts it in there. And he's kind of a detail guy in a way, so he throws that in there, but he doesn't give us any more information. So if that comes close to trying to answer the question, that's the best I know how to do with it in that regard. Other than that, I don't know. We need to ask somebody that was there. Nobody? Okay, very good. What's that? Well, I think we'll probably get a chance somewhere down the road, or we'll know somewhere down when, what does the song say? Farther along, we'll know all about it. Well, maybe we will. I don't know. Okay. Okay, is that enough for that question? I guess. Okay. Oh, I didn't get to the question. There it is, right there in front of us. What happened there? Okay, now then, I should not forget to do that. Those are the things we just talked about. You got on your paper. All right, now, next question. I'll try to remember to move forward in it. Sorry for you folks at home that I didn't do better with that. I apologize. That's the common thing with me. Okay. I don't know how these guys remember to do that all the time that do that. I don't know. My brain doesn't work very well sometimes. Okay, here we are. Here's the next question. Here it is. What does it mean to be in the world but not of the world? Well, I've met some people that I'm not sure they were really of this world. Oh, that's not what it's talking about here. Okay, very good. Okay, good question. It's a very good question, and I think with some really good answers. And you've got to recognize that world is often used with two kinds of meanings particularly, and some variations with that. Not specifically in this passage, but in this passage is talking about the physical world, but it also is a reference to the spiritual world. World is used with two meanings. One, the physical nature of the world. We understand that. Are we in the world? As far as I know, we are. We're tangible beings. We're here. We're living, breathing, sort of, and getting along. We are in the world. The greater question is, what does it mean to be not of the world? And that's when we're talking about the spiritual character or the nature of the spiritual world. Did you have something, Danny? Go ahead. Sorry, I messed you up. I kept going when you were ready to answer a while ago. Okay, all right. If you're like me, it'll come back around. About the time I lay down and go to bed at night, it'll come back around. Anyway, if you come up with it, what you're going to say. But we're dealing with really two different aspects of that. Yeah, go ahead.
Our hope is not in this world. Our hope is
Okay, that's right.
we have to live a certain way.
Okay. Yes, and that's what it comes down to. Our hope is not in this world or of this physical world, so we have to live a certain way because our hope lies in God's realm of a different world in that sense. So the word world is used in a little bit different meanings in here. We commonly just say this world, and we just kind of lump it together. Is everything about this world bad? No, in fact, when God created, he looked at it and he said, it's very good. Yeah, you go back to Genesis, very good. He wasn't just talking about the garden at that point. He was talking about the world, and it was very good. He looked at it that way and said it was very good. Even humanity, and he says it was very good. So this world has many wonderful things about it, and it is God's world. Several years ago, Jim McGuigan wrote a book entitled The Reign of God, and he talked about the different kingdoms of God in that. I think that was the book that was in, because this world is, in a sense, God's kingdom. Why? Because he created it. He made it to be. He set it in order. He causes it to function as it does. That really doesn't have much to do with this, except that when we talk about the world, we don't always need to talk about the physical world in a negative sense. But there is a sense in which world is used in a negative sense. And sometimes we use the term worldliness, tied up to the character of the world. And what this seems to have reference to, and what Jesus is saying, look down at John 15. Okay, yeah, John 15 and verse 19. He tells his disciples, if you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. In other words, you don't fit their image in that regard. So tied into what we're saying, in the world, but not of the world, and we often use those two phrases in that regard. I think we have to recognize that perhaps we've all been places where we literally were physically present, but we didn't feel like we fully belonged. And that kind of gets into that idea, this world is not our home. Go ahead, sir.
Doesn't the question apply to the believer, and does it not apply to the non-believer?
Yes, this would be an application only to believers in particular. Of course, Jesus is addressing his closest disciples, not talking about people who not speaking to people who don't believe in him. So this would be an application to believers. Yes, yes, sir. You're exactly right in that regard. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
The first part of that, doesn't that kind of address the idea of secreting yourself in a monastery?
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, your question is, doesn't that imply secreting yourself in a monastery or whatever? And I'm saying that for others to hear what you just said. Yeah, how are we going to be really not in or of the world? We'd have to kind of wall ourselves off completely from the world. Well, that doesn't work very well. There are those who have tried to do that and isolate themselves fully from everything in the world, but it doesn't really work, and that was not where we were intended to be. You're mentioning Sodom and Gomorrah a while ago. Lot lived among the people of Sodom, but he is referred to as righteous Lot in another place. And so he still had his faith in God, but he lived among people who did not have a faith in God in that regard. We might question Lot a little bit, but that's from our perspective. And I think we can see that. But as I said, we've all been places literally where we didn't feel like we were comfortable, that we didn't really belong. Have you ever gone and sat down in a movie theater, started watching a movie, and then before long you're thinking, man, this is not a movie for me. I don't mean it's just a crummy movie. There's some of those, but the content of the movie was something that was unacceptable to you, and maybe you even got up and left in that. I hope you did. If it wasn't, but we've been places where we didn't feel like we really belong. Maybe we've been among people and associating with people that made us really uncomfortable, and you realized the things that they talked about, the things that they did, were not the things that fit into your life. And so you were among them, but you were not of them. You weren't really like them. And that's what I think this is implying. We live in the physical world here, but we do not partake of the character that is found in so many of the people of the world. Does that make sense? We're bound to live here. Paul deals with this, and I should have put this in the notes, when he talked about, judging and everything. He says, don't take your brother to court out here. But you work within yourselves to do that. You guys need to work within yourselves to figure out and solve these problems. Don't take it to the outside world, because they can't really judge properly your conduct within. And so Jesus, he said, but we don't apply that outwardly to the outside world. We don't see ourselves in the same level as worldliness. And we shouldn't see ourselves in that same level. So we make a segregation in that regard. It says, yes, I live in the same world. I live in the same town, same street. I live next door, whatever it might be. I live here and among them, but I do not endorse the same character of ungodliness that might be in their lives or is in their lives. I don't allow it in my life. And that's why I mentioned Lot and Sodom, okay? Thoughts or anything in that regard? Basically, we physically live in the physical world, but the character of our lives is drawn from a different source than the one that designs the character of this world. Ephesians 2 and verse 2, I mentioned down there, if you've looked at that, in which you once walked, he talked about you were dead, you were made alive who were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you once walked according to the course of this world. He's talking about the way the world looks at life and the way the world approaches life. According to the prince of the power of the air, there he's referencing the devil in that regard, referring to him as the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience. They don't think anything about disobeying God, but you, by your sense, you're going to determine to obey God, where they're going to not determine to obey God. You may live on the same street, you may work at the same jobs, but you do not carry the same belief system that they do. That's the way I take it. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering how, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, like in the passage 19 through 23, Paul's talking about becoming all things to all people. And I'm wondering, how does this and that intersect?
It doesn't, so let's don't look at it. No, you mentioned that before class. He told me, he said that, and I said, we'll bring that up in class. All right, Paul says, to the strong, I became strong, under the law is under the law, those without the law is without the law. I became all things to all men, that I might by all means win some. How can we do that and still maintain what we're talking about here? I think is the question you're saying. How can we be in touch with people of the world and yet not be of the world? Anybody got a thought? There always has to be a difference. If you're going to win someone, there has to be a difference. If you're not going to win someone, then if you're the same as they are, you don't have to win them. Only by being different can you win somebody over to something. Paul wasn't saying that we become exactly as them in ungodliness. He was just saying there are things that we can do and should do to be able to associate with people. It's challenging to figure out where those lines are sometimes, and I think that's probably where you would go with it. It's challenging to know where do we stop those lines, where do we go that we can associate with them enough that we can reach them and so forth. Again, that goes back to the idea we don't go to monasteries and separate ourselves and keep a big block between us and them, or else we're never going to be able to win them. But they need to see that we are human beings in like manner as them. How to fully do that, I don't know. And when Paul said, as those under the law became as one under the law, yes, he was still a Jew. Those without the law, he understood grace and so forth. So I don't know whether that fully answers your question, but it is a challenging concept. How do I go this far without fully indulging in that? Okay.
That's the question I actually had too right before you said that. And I was thinking, how to be in the world and kind of associating with all the people and differentiating yourself, but not in a pretentious way, in a loving way, be able to still get to the.
Yes.
I think if you love people and you want to see
Yeah.
all people ultimately get to heaven. We know that not all people will, but we would love to see them all.
Sure. I think one of the problems we run into and when you start associating, is a desensitization in which we then begin to embrace their behaviors into ourselves rather than drawing them into what we see as right with God. Yeah, the other way around. And that's always a challenge. Now, I had a couple other hands out here.
This is one of the things, though, that Paul was sent to,
Yes,
the unloved, the Gentiles.
that's right. And he was sent specifically to the Gentiles in that regard, and yet he still worked among the Jews to some degree. Yeah, very good. Yeah. You had something, Debbie? Okay. Dwayne?
Well, and I just, somebody, and I'm not gonna mention names because we really shouldn't.
Don't embarrass me.
We sponsor
Okay.
in a foreign country,
Okay.
okay? But last time, or not last time, one time when he was here, we talked about it, and I think he even mentioned it in his presentation, that sometimes it's, people ask me, how do you teach somebody that has such different
Right.
beliefs, and he said a lot of times it's easier to teach that person because they are a religious person in general.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to go to a agnostic or an atheist or
Okay.
something, he said many times it's easier to get those people.
Very good. Sometimes it's easier to teach somebody that is dedicated in a different direction because you can see the obvious difference in the person who's fairly close, and they think, well, okay, we're close in that regard, but very different. You had your hand up all ago, Trey. Did we get? And I didn't get back to you. You forgot. Fred stole your thought. Good for you. Seemed like I saw another hand a while ago. Did I see another hand somewhere? Okay. Okay. Correct. Those who are sick need the physician. Right. Good point. Okay.
under the standard of God, living the right life. And this has been a really controversial thing because they're trying to say that they're not allowed in the churches. I said, but however, we're not here to teach and to live in a standard of love and things because you're going to lose people. That's the whole thing is to find God and to help them understand who God is.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best way to love somebody is to be institutional.
Yeah. I think you're right, and very good point, and very clear. Of course, I was thinking. Of course, they questioned Jesus. You know, you're hanging out with sinners and so forth, and he said, "Well, who?" And that's what you were referencing. Who needs me? You know, who needs the physician? That's exactly right. But the people who are sick, and so it is a challenge. But there we go. Yes, sir. Do you want Fred to say it for you? Okay, go ahead.
I mean, in John 15:19, it says the world's going to hate you.
Yes.
We're not going to be, we're called out. We're not going to fit in.
That's right.
And we're going to be hated. And we might get our heads chopped off, like some of the early Christians did. And that should be a sobering thought for the way that we live our lives today. When it seemed really easy to fit in, easy to
Yes.
follow the lead of the world. And you should kind of reflect. Am I hated by the world like Christ said I would be?
Okay. I think it's a good point. Now, I want us to be careful because even as you pointing out, we become all things to all men. There are qualities in people who are even ungodly, and Paul speaks about that even the Gentiles do by nature things that are under the law. There are people who are ungodly that do things that are godly in their behavioral patterns, but their reasoning, their justification, and their limitations are not the same. Yes, we're going to stand out from them at some point or another in that difference. Very good. And when it says hate us, it could just be simply as simple as shunning. It could be legally prohibiting. It could be a lot of things. And you were talking, or Dwayne was talking about some and dealing with that in some places and everything. Very good. Okay? Good thoughts. Good thoughts. Final question this evening. We can't cover all of this by any means. Maybe something for another time when we really look at this, but I went ahead and threw the question here. What do we know about Joseph's brothers? We don't like them. Well, what do we know? We know there were 11 of them because there were 12 altogether and a sister. We know they had at least one sister. There were 11 of them: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. According to their mothers, Leah had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. Bilhah, the handmaid, had Dan and Naphtali. Zilpah, the other handmaid, had Gad and Asher. And Rachel had Joseph and Benjamin. What do we know about them? We know they were jealous of Joseph. They sold him into slavery and pretended that animals had killed him and told that to their father, and so he believed they were dead. We do know that they did have some conscience about him because they seem to have regretted their behavior towards Joseph at later points in that regard. They did seem to care enough about their father to have some respect for him. We know that they moved to Egypt during the famine under the direction of Joseph, brought them to Egypt, and they lived the remainder of their natural lives there in Egypt with their families growing and living there with their families. And I'd just say they were fairly typical of the culture of the times. What do we know specifically about them? If you mean, do we know exactly how long some of them lived and everything? We may not have all the details of that in that regard. But if you want to know that, we can do some research. Some of it is guesstimation. Some of it is drawn from outside sources that can't be necessarily verified. But that's kind of the synopsis that I throw in there. We really don't know a great deal about each one. When you get down to, if you want to know something about them, go down to some of the final words of Jacob when he describes each one of them and the blessings, and he tells a little bit about each one and their nature and their character, and you'll kind of get a picture of how he saw them in that regard. And that's a good way to look at it. I didn't have room to put all that in here this evening, but there would be some of that in there if you want to know about them in particular. I forgot to jump forward, but these are some of the things I just jotted those down and said those are the things that generally we know about them. If you're wanting to know more about them, we can get into their families and that and how they ended up in the way they did in that regard. Okay. Yes, sir. And God did bring their heritage, their offspring, into the promised land ultimately after a rejection of 40 years and everything. But and the many years before that. But he did bring them and it was their children, their heritage that was brought there and divided up the land and threw out the people ahead of them. So, very good. Yeah.
Scripture only speaks of a few of them. Some of them we don't know anything.
You're right. The scriptures do not really describe much on some of them at all. Even Jacob's words at the end are fairly limited on some, a little longer on others in that regard. Yeah, they were not men of extremely high godly character necessarily in all respects, but they were his sons, and they were the lineage through whom God was going to work. They were Abraham's lineage at that point. And that could make a good study as much as we want to, and maybe something we do sometime in looking at each of them as best we can and how their lineage followed through in that regard. But at least that's a brief synopsis on that. Any other thought on that or something? I don't know. Okay. There's the second bell. So I don't even get to throw any questions at you in that regard. Man, what kind of deal is that? Something that interests me, and then I'll let you go, and you'll notice the end when we get down to the questions. In the last one, when the tribes of Israel are listed, it's rare to see Joseph's name being mentioned. Very rarely do you see, and there's a mention of the tribe of Joseph. We don't mention Joseph as a tribe much. You mention his sons and their tribes. And we talk about the 12 tribes, and I think I grew up thinking there were we've got all this 12 tribes, and then there was Levi. But you've got 12 divisions of the land because you got 2 of Joseph's brought in there that kind of takes the place of Levi, and Levi doesn't really get the land. While they get cities and farmland and so forth, they don't get a specific property among the other tribes in that regard. But we always talk about the 12 tribes, and quite often we're talking about even Joseph's sons. And that's just something of interest if you want to think about that sometime. But we've addressed most of the things that were in these questions anyway at this point. But I appreciate it. Very good questions. You might notice next week, oh, there it was. Next week, oh, how did that happen? Something happened. All right. Well, it's on your sheet of paper back there. We're going to talk about, I don't know what happened, how I didn't get that slide changed properly. Comments, we're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 21. It's an interesting and a kind of a challenging passage to look at, and we're going to talk about that. There's 2 or 3 things in there that are well worth our time. And then we'll begin with some others comparing the way Jesus treated different groups of people in that regard, and I think it should be some interesting discussions in that regard, but those were put forward. And then there's some even more challenging ones for us to deal with. I was kind of putting the hard ones off until I could be absent and somebody could take my place, but in all seriousness, there's some very good questions, and again, if you have more you want to add, be glad for you to put them in the box or whatever, or as I said, you can text them or email them to me and we'll try to take care of them. I'm not taking them necessarily in order or in order of importance. I'm just kind of working my way through them. And so if you put in a question, you say, well, wait a minute, I haven't seen mine yet. Hopefully you'll see it come up and we'll deal with it along the way unless I lost it somewhere. Okay? Very good. Thank you all for being here this evening. I hope that you feel like it was well worth your time and you don't get wet on the way out.